Unity of Houston is an inclusive church where we seek to understand and live the teachings of Jesus and other spiritual masters. At Unity, we welcome all people from all spiritual paths and every walk of life. We celebrate the diversity of our city and of our world, and we teach love, tolerance, and oneness, seeking to live in harmony with open minds and open hearts.
Wherever you are in your spiritual path, you are always welcome at Unity. Join us and discover that the life of your dreams is already within you.
Wonderful to be here together tonight with you all with us, feeling your presence and your energy as we inhabit our awareness of grace at work in our lives and in this moment. Grace means goodwill, favor, the support of God. In Scripture, in John 1:17 says, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And so the way that we understand that grace is that the transforming power that came to mankind through the work of Jesus established a new and a higher consciousness on earth. That consciousness was always present, but we know that Jesus Christ, our master teacher, established it in his teachings as he shared it, and that consciousness, that awareness, that awakening has moved us forward in our awareness of our oneness with God. One of the tools that Jesus gave us to take on that higher awareness is the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer is a series of affirmations, and we've been studying it on Sundays, and on Wednesday nights, the tool that we've been using is Setting a Trap for God by Rocco Errico, the Aramaic scholar. And we've chosen this study because Aramaic is the language that Jesus spoke in, which was then translated into Greek, which became the Scripture. And so there are some nuances to the language that we can study and bring into our spiritual awareness through studying the original Aramaic words that he would have spoken. So the second half of the prayer, we're into the second half of the prayer. The first half really had to do with establishing ourselves in our awareness of our oneness with God. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. We're remembering the truth of our oneness. And as we move into this next part of the prayer, give us this day our daily bread. We are now moving into our earthly manifestation. So now what we are calling for through the infinite potential and provision of God into our human experience. And so the first thing that Jesus gives us to affirm, not beg, not plead, not get down on our knees and hope, but to affirm, give us this day our daily bread, in an awareness that it is already provided. And the Aramaic is Havlan Lokma Dushun Kanang Yaumana. To understand the original meaning of these words, Rocco Errico tells us that we need to look at the attitude of the Eastern people toward bread. So that it literally translates into provide us our needful bread from day to day. And so these people in the Near East, the people who were living in the time of Jesus, that they lived very simply, and they would bake their bread just for the day. They didn't bake loaves, big loaves, or certainly didn't go to the grocery store and have their sandwich slices and parcel it out for the week. They would bake just what they needed for that day for their family, as well as a little extra considering any travelers or strangers who may come by. They're very hospitable people. And part of their culture, because there are so many people traveling by foot in those times, that they would open their doors to their fellow traveler and provide bread for them. So they always had a little extra to share, and an awareness that that person who they cared for, who was a stranger, a traveler in their house one day, they may be their host another day as that person goes off and travels, and whether by foot or by donkey or camel or what have you, that they may stop into their house. And so it's that mutuality of giving that is so beautiful in the culture. So the bread is baked to last just one day. And so give us this day our daily bread is really that faith, that trust, that that bread is going to be available day to day. And imagine how wonderful it was to live then and to smell that bread baking every day. And so what was interesting too as we look at this study is that they treated their fellow travelers well, but that they even treated their enemies well. That if an enemy came to their house, their custom was you could stay 3 days. And they would provide food and shelter and sword. They were to protect you. They would even protect you. However, people knew that before the third night, get out, because then all bets are off, and enemies once more, I guess. So this was a really interesting aspect of their culture, that they would take in an enemy, they agreed to do that, to provide for them for 3 days. That was the etiquette. The Easterners believe that bread is God's provision. They had the conscious awareness that the food, the sustenance that they are given is of God. And so that was the way they spoke about it in their culture, and that the bread had a sacred, mystical quality to it. And they would make covenants with each other when they would make agreements with someone else. And what they called it was a bread and salt covenant. That's how sacred bread was to them. They would say, there is bread and salt between us. And that was a sincere and a solemn agreement that they had with each other. And if it was broken, it may sound lighthearted, bread and salt, it was very serious. If it was broken, then that breach of trust considered that person unworthy forever, unworthy of trust forever with that person if they broke that covenant. It was the idea of bread was considered consecrated in the same way that now we would consider the communion host to be consecrated. It has been blessed. They considered all bread like that, because before they would even bake it, they were blessing it. When they were farming, when they were putting their seeds in the ground, they were blessing the seeds. They understood it was all from God. This understanding made me think about an experience that I had when I was studying in the spiritual direction program at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas. I was going up there, it was a 3-year program, and I was going up there 3 times a year, and we would study. We'd get there on Friday, we'd have classes Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then at the end of the session on Sunday, we would have a worship service. And part of the worship service was to have communion. And it was presided over by a minister, and the bread was blessed. And the bread was a big loaf, kind of what we think about when we think of bread. Maybe what I thought of as maybe the bread they had back then was like one of those big round loaves that has like, you know, it was just crusty, and that wasn't the kind of bread that they had. But that's the bread that I think of when I think of communion. And they would you tear a piece off a hunk off the loaf, and then dip it into the wine, and then eat it. And what I noticed was the head of the department, his name is Dr. Havito, wonderful teacher, and he had been a priest, and that after the communion, he was going around picking up little crumbs off of the floor and putting them in his pocket. And I thought, they let the head of the department pick up the crumbs off. Come on, nobody's going to step in. And then I noticed how careful he was about it. Going down to the floor, and picking it up and putting it in his pocket. And I've recognized that that was holy for him, that he recognized that that was blessed bread and that wasn't to be trampled on after the communion was over, that that was to be disposed of in the right way. I was glad he didn't eat it. But that just that simple honoring, recognition of God's blessing upon that. It was just such a holy moment for me. And then it was wonderful to see that whenever it happened. Grateful that he demonstrated that for us. So like the song that we shared, By Thy Grace, the Easterners do everything in God's holy name. That is how they spoke, they continued their practice. The men called on God's name as they planted the seeds in the harvest, and the women called on God's name as they kneaded the dough and baked it. And they were aware of their source. Provide us, give us this day our daily bread. Reminded them that God provides us the bread. And so Eastern bread, so it isn't like that big hunky loaf that's crusty, that it was thin like a Mexican tortilla and fairly big, 10 to 12 inches. And Marco Errico said that he went on a trip and 40 people ate off of one of these. I don't know how that's possible. 12 inches isn't that much to me. But they shared it, they divvied it up, and that was the practice that they have there. And they could take this flatbread and fold it up like a handkerchief and put it in their pocket. And so because they walked and traveled so much, they could carry some of this bread with them, enough for the day. They needed to carry their provision for the day because inns were scarce there, and they didn't know when they would have what they needed. And so whenever they sat, the custom was to share the bread. So what they learned was that if they didn't want, they needed more, they didn't want to share whatever, that they would secretly eat the bread as they were walking. And there's a spiritual significance to that as well, of the secret bread, as we consider the bread that we experience in secret in the holy place within us. There's some significance. So bread, there are various meanings of that word bread. Give us this day our daily bread. That the Aramaic word not only reflected actual bread, so if you're gluten-free, no worries, it also meant food. So whatever food that you're receiving throughout the day, and symbolically it represents ideas, our prosperity. In metaphysics, we understand that our true prosperity is divine ideas. The infinite flow of divine ideas are always available to us, and it is from those ideas that we manifest, that we create form. That is our spiritual food that is always given so that we may prosper. And the bread also refers to truth and understanding that is given from the divine. And so we know that when Jesus went out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, that he fasted. He ate no bread, he ate no drink. He fasted for 40 days. And the Gospel of Matthew says after the 40 days and nights, he was led out into the desert. And so as you can imagine, Jesus was tired, he was weak, and he was hungry. 40 days, it's unimaginable. And yet we see this story of our master teacher, and he's led out into the desert, and Satan comes to him and says, if you are the Son of God, turn these stones to bread. Well, why don't you just make some bread for yourself because you need it, you're hungry, right? And we could even think of this rather than an external person or a physical form like a devil or Satan, like a kind of a dark energy that comes to us when we feel like we're not at our best, when we're hungry, when we're tired, when we've had enough, when we've had crisis overload, as we may be having in this time. It just seems like a lot of things keep coming up. That there's this temptation that comes, and Jesus responds with a quote from the words of Deuteronomy, from the law of his people, the Hebrew law, and he said, "It is written, man cannot live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." So this first temptation that Jesus had involved bread, just the basic sustenance of our physical being. And what happens when we don't have our physical needs met, when we go into fear of survival? We go into this base level of animalistic kind of fear. So consider when you get afraid, when your well-being is at stake, in whatever way maybe that has shown up for you in your life lately. If your survival feels like it's at stake, do you fall into fear? Do you fall into old ways of self-protection, old ways of getting your needs met where they may be harmful to others? They may be words, emotions, actions that are not your highest and best. There are many opportunities throughout our week that we can operate from a choice of our survival instinct or trust in God. And like the song says, I surrender, I surrender, I surrender. To surrender even that and even that and even that so that we can return to the trust in God. And it takes stillness and self-love and practice to do that, to move back into our awareness of God as our source, to release fear, to release the limitations of what we see outside of ourselves, which is only ever a partial view. It's only ever some of the information. It certainly is not all there is in God, all the possibilities, always available, our provision. And so if there's an area in your life where you are caught in fear and falling back into ways that you go, I'm just under so much stress, I don't feel like myself right now. To surrender, let go, return back home to God. There's a peace in you where you're not afraid, even when you're afraid. Even when you're experiencing fear, we don't have to be afraid of fear. We can allow fear as it arises and witness it from that space of the peace that we are, the peace within us. So I'll close with a reminder once again of that song that we shared, I Trust in God. Let that be your mantra this week. I trust in God for my daily bread. Our daily bread begins like these Near Easterners did in Jesus' time and continue to do in that culture. As they prepare their food, whether it came from a grocery store or you baked it yourself, that remembering it came from God. And then see if you can expand that into every area of your life and allow yourself to see that even in the difficult moments and areas. Repeat that. I trust in God. I trust in God. Say it with me. I trust in God. And so as you pray, give us this day our daily bread. As you pray that, use that as a way to open, to release your fears, to trust in that provision provided. As you walk, the provision is needed. And return to the peace of God that always dwells in you, that is the very truth of your being, that we remember as we focus on the simplicity of the bread that we receive every day. Namaste.
Thank you for watching this message today. I'd like to invite you to join us in person here on campus at Unity of Houston for Sunday morning or Wednesday evening services. If you can't be with us here on our campus, you can still join us live on Facebook or on our website, unityhouston.org, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. Central.